presentation today is going to be dealing with livestock and big game. That's the area that I'm most familiar with, and I do most of my work. And as we all know, livestock and big game interactions in the state of Arizona dates back to before the turn of the 20th century. And here we are in the 21st century already. And I think John Hall, the director of Arizona Game and Fish in 1955, really said it well when he described this process, and he says, the intensity of the conflict between wildlife and livestock has not decreased, but only grown with time. We must face the fact, and the fact is that at the present time, all of the other conflicting interests on our rangelands must force us to work out some mutual solution to the problem of livestock versus wildlife. That's as valid today as it was almost 60 years ago. So what's happened in this nearly 60 years? Well, the first thing we saw was in 1960, the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act from the Forest Service, or aimed at the Forest Service or the Department of Agriculture lands, that directed them to begin managing not just for timber and grazing, but for all resources. So we included water, recreation, and wildlife. Following that, in 1976, we see the Federal Land Policy Management Act, which extended that direction from the Forest Service to the Bureau of Land Management and their management of public lands. And we see it says the whole goal was so that they are utilized in combination to meet the best and present the future needs of American people. So with that, what we ended up, especially when we started talking about multiple species on that land, the idea that we're going to have multiple species management. And when we define multiple species management, it's the presence and grazing of more than one species, whether it be domestic or wildlife. And they're going to be on that same rangeland resource during a year. As a result, in concept, multiple species management is more efficient and uniform utilization of the resource. But with that comes also a problem. We have this other one consequence of dual use is that common use of the resource increasing the likelihood of interaction between those grazing species, which means we've got competition. And when I look at competition, what is competition? It is a supply and demand relationship. As long as we have supply in excess of demand, can we have competition? There's more than enough resource to meet both species. It's not a competitive situation. As soon as supply decreases or demand increases so that we're no longer a balanced situation, we've got a competitive interaction. So what happens in a competitive interaction? We're looking at a situation where the number of one organism utilizing a common resource has a negative impact on that other individual because it's in short supply, or because that utilization by itself has a negative impact, is harmful to that second species. So for us to really get this to work, we need to understand more about this supply and demand relationship. Let's look at supply first of all. From our standpoint as resource managers, supply has four elements: space, water, actually three elements, excuse me, space, water, and vegetation abundance. And I say three as opposed to four. We're all used to listening to food, water, cover, and space. Well, let's face it, cover and food in that context is vegetation abundance. All right? What is competition for space? Can we consume space? As that animal, as soon as it walks off, that space is now available for the second species to use again. So it's really not a consumptive use. Water, That's its own problems all in and of itself. So we're most commonly looking at the vegetation parameter. Structurally, that's cover, and then quantity, abundance, is food. Let's look at the spatial domain, and not spatial, let's look at the demand domain, and we can break it up into 3 dimensions. First of all is the temporal, the timing of use. What is governing that process? And when I look at the timing of use, what I'm talking about, especially if we're talking federal lands, livestock aren't on there all the time. Most commonly, they have a turn-on date and a removal date. And in most cases, what we see is my wildlife species will have been there before. Is that cow coming in going to be impacting that species A at that time? No, they're not even there. Not only are they not even there, they haven't been there for a while. So the vegetation abundance, the response, has not been impacted. However, as soon as those animals, the second species, does show up on this rangeland resource, in many cases, especially if it's livestock, what do the wildlife do? They're going to be displaced off. Now, whether that displacement is a direct competition or a direct interaction of that cow with that wild species is of some question. I'm more inclined to believe it's a reaction of that third species that joins the cow, and that's called humans, that it's displacing. But even then, what happened to that animal B? It's already had its resource, the availability of the food resource and partially the cover resource, affected by the first species, hasn't it? So now what we see is species A is having an impact on species B, even though it's not present. And we can continue that process on in time, because when that domestic animal comes off that resource and that wild animal returns, we're now looking at that species A again being impacted by what species B had done prior to its removal. And so we see this timing of use. Now, what we're going to have to do is keep that temporal process in mind when we start talking about the other 2 dimensions, basically the spatial and the forage dimension. So let's look at that spatial dimension. This is governed by occupation. Are they there in the same piece of ground at the same time or in some staggered process? How much overlap do we have? If we have an area and both animals, let's say we've got 3,500 hectares, and we've got enough animals that they use all 3,500 hectares, both species, I've got a total overlap. And that spatial overlap is going to be a value of 1. That normal? Probably not. And so we see this partial overlap or incomplete overlap. Now we have species A occupying a fairly large area. Species B is somewhat smaller. But the point is, I don't have any competition out here or here, do I? It's only where they're in joint overlap, joint occupation. And in this case, it's an uneven joint occupation, because we see that the area that species A, the area that species A is occupying on B is only about 40%. We see 40% of this area occupied. If I look the other way around, it's only about 25%. So it's a disproportionate. But it can get even worse. Because if we have a situation where I've got one species that's occupying the entire area, that entire 3,500 hectares I talked about, and my other species is there at the same time but only occupying 1,000 acres of it, who's going to have the biggest impact? Species A is going to have a much bigger impact than species B because it's not there. All right, so we see this disproportionate spatial overlap. That brings us to this vegetation. And when we say vegetation, the quantitative measures, we see that, or abundance measures, we can see it in two components. The qualitative, that is the percent overlap between the species in their forage utilization or plant utilization. And finally, a quantitative, one that describes how much is being removed relative to one another. Now, when I look at that qualitative, the idea of species overlap, or not species overlap, diet similarities, this is probably, as far as animals and competition concerned, well, the one thing that's been studied the most. Just about everybody has done something like this to try and get a handle on these two, on the interaction of two species. And for the most case, we see it being broken down into a percent, where we range between 0 and 1. Now, let me point out two things on this figure. If we look here in the horizontal, and each of these is 3 different processes, this horizontal is talking about the species presence. So I've got a range from the species 1 through species 473. How do they overlap? And the second is the height, the vertical, is the proportion of each plant being consumed. And in this first case, they don't overlap in their diet. Are they going to be competing? Obviously not. If I go to the second case, now I've got overlap. They're using some of the same species. So the intensity of that overlap is going to dictate how much diet similarity. And finally, in the last one, if I have total overlap, everybody's using the same plant species, then I got a value of 1. What's the problem with this? It doesn't allow for disproportionality between this use. It's assuming everybody is going to use it at the same intensity, and all we're looking at is the species overlap. What's the practicality of that approach? Not very good, I'm sure. So, a couple of authors by the name of MacArthur and Levins proposed this idea that we could analyze for that if we look at the sum of the products of diet species A, or I for animal A and animal B, and divide it then by the square of that for A. And that will give us the impact, in this case, of species B on species A. Likewise, if I do the same thing and just reverse or create a new denominator, where the denominator is species B's choice squared, now I have the impact of species A on B. I account for this disproportionality now, don't I? I have a means of measuring it. And as a result, there is now the possibility that one of these animals can have an impact on the other greater than 1. All right, we've got all these elements. We put them all together. Oh, well, I got one more, I'm sorry. How many people have ever seen the old SCS range evaluation system that said if you're going to have 2 species there, and I'm just going to pick elk and cattle for the easiest one, that meant that if I'm going to have 1 cow, I'm replacing 2 elk, or if I'm going to put 2 elk on it, I'm going to replace 1 cow. What was the basis of that? Consumption equivalence. And it's based on the idea that why the SCS chose it back in the late 1940s and said a cow will always be a 1,000-pound animal, 454 kilos. An elk will always be a 500-pound animal. How many people have seen a 500-pound cow elk in the state of Arizona? Not many hands. And that a deer would always be a 220-pound deer. Let's go down and talk about a Coues whitetail. Are we going to get 220-pound Coues whitetail? If you ever find one and you collect it, You got a Boone and Crockett record right there, okay? So the problem with this is it really doesn't hold, does it? And when we look at true consumption equivalents, it's the amount consumed relative to one another. So if I've got this 235 kilo animal, it's eating at about 2.5% of its body weight per day, it's going to eat 5.88 kilos a day. Likewise, this 450 kilo animal eating at that same 2.5% rate is going to eat about 11.25 kilos a day. So what am I talking about then? Well, if I look at the impact of B on A, that 11.25 divided by the 5.88, that animal B replaces 1.9 animal A. And conversely, the 5.88 divided by 11.2 says that animal A only replaces 5.2 or 0.52 of animal A, all right, or animal B, excuse me. So we see this disproportionality here. Well, my question for you is, what does all this mean? Where do we get from this? We're getting to the point of a trade-off. And a trade-off, Jack Nelson in 1984 defined a trade-off as the changes in the number of animal species as a result of the addition or deletion of an individual of the second species. How do we change that number? And if we go on to look at it, it's the compilation of all these factors we talked about. The availability, the temporal dimension, the spatial dimension, the vegetative dimension. How do we get all these together? And we can do that by simply saying it's the product of alpha, which is that rate of change, alpha and beta, is diet similarity times the consumption equivalent times the percent overlap. Where did my temporal dimension come in? Came in when I calculated the diet similarity. The spring diet of one animal on the summer diet of the second species, the summer diet of the second species on the fall diet of my first species returning. So I've included all those temporal elements. Now, you're going to see in an example I'm going to give you here in just a few minutes that that temporal also exchanges or goes to the range overlap, the spatial overlap. All right? So how do we get this? The primary implication then is how can we calculate this relationship of the number of animals? And we do that using a standard population equation, where the number of animals of species A I can have on this ground is equal to the carrying capacity of species A minus then alpha, which is that trade-off I mentioned, times the number of animal species B. That gives me what my true number I can have. And likewise then, K2 or B is equal to KB minus beta and A. And so I can get this trade-off real easy. I can measure that. Let's look at this. Let's give you a practical example. From 1990 to 1994, we did a study on the Coconino National Forest in the area of Clints Well. It was called the Pivot Rock Allotment. The two primary species, grazing species we had here was elk and cattle. Part of a Forest Service grazing permit. The cattle came in on the 15th of May and they were removed on the 1st of October. The allotment was divided into 8 subunits. So it was a rotation grazing system. And they were moved through it. And so we came in and we measured the vegetation before the animals were there. In other words, trying to quantify, in this case, spring elk use. We measured the vegetation and all the habitat characteristics once the cattle were removed. That became the summer livestock use, but we did it in each pasture individually. Why did we do it that way? Well, typically when the livestock showed up, the cattle moved off. How far did they move? Either outside the allotment or to the next pasture, one or the other. And we did this all the way through until the livestock left, and then we came back in and measured the whole thing one more time, just before the snow flew. So that we had spring elk, we had summer livestock, and we had a fall elk use. All right? The carrying capacity, K, for elk was 547 animal units. For cattle, 219 animal units. We looked at the temporal, and we just described the temporal for you. We had elk in the spring, no competition. We had cattle in the summer, had spring competition from the elk. We look at the fall, the cattle were gone, so now we had summer cattle impacting fall elk. And that's my temporal arrangement. With that in mind, then we started looking at overlap. This allotment was a little over 3,500 hectares. We see that in the spring, elk had used 2,000, almost 2,200 hectares of that area. When the cattle came in, they used almost all 3,500 of it, but more importantly, 1,700 of it had been previously used by the elk. So there's my spatial overlap of spring cattle on summer, or spring elk on summer cattle. Once the cattle left, the elk returned. When they returned, they used 1,600 hectares. Math isn't too hard. That's less than half the area. And of that area they used, 945 had been previously used. Kind of strange, isn't it? They still had another 1,700 that wasn't used by the elk. Why did they go back to that same location where cattle had used it? How many people have ever heard of the concept of facilitation? In that, as a result of previous use by one animal, it has enhanced the habitat, in this case forage quality, for the second species. And that's exactly what happened, because as we came back in and we started measuring the vegetation, we found that the vegetation in these reuse areas had higher crude protein content, higher digestibility, lower cell wall content, better nutritional quality. And I don't know how many of you know much about Arizona fescue, but it has a fungal endophyte in it that grows in the roots. And as a result, that fungal endophyte takes the vegetation, from, or the sugar from the plant, and produces alkaloids in the plant which suppress taste. Because the cattle had used it, they're much less picky. Now the elk had cleaner, fresher vegetation. So we take that and put this all together. I'm not going to bore you with how we calculated it, but we see that the cattle on elk diet overlap was 1.195. The elk on cattle is 0.72. We already calculated the consumption equivalents previously. So I put them all together, and I get an alpha impact of cattle on elk of 0.84 and a beta impact of elk on cattle of 0.19. Or in other words, one cow only replaces 0.84 or 84% of an elk. And that it takes 2 1/4 elk to replace a single cow. So what does that give us? Here's the true story here. What are we doing? Here is my carrying capacity of 547 for elk, 219 for cattle. If I use these alphas with increasing cattle or increasing elk, the alpha of 0.83 and a beta of 0.19, I can see I can calculate an optimal stocking. That point where I can have the maximum number, maximum number of both animals. And it came out to 419 elk and 140 cows. The true stocking rate for this area was down here. Less than 300 elk and about 120 cows. So what's my take home from this whole thing? Well, first of all, any form of wildlife and livestock interaction is a resource-based issue. It's surrounded by supply and demand. Secondly, that livestock interaction is a multidimensional interaction. It includes availability, temporal, spatial, and consumptive concerns. And finally, in many cases, this level of interaction is not nearly as intensive as what we previously thought. And with that, I'll be glad to try and answer any questions. Yes?
What about species C for D?
All right, that's fine. All we have to do is, come on, one more. This is an additive because now I have alpha is this, in other words, I get this for species B on A, and then I do the same thing and calculate the same way between the two species and sum them together. So I take off 0.84 for species A, another 0.32 for species B, so it becomes an additive process. So I can have multi-species interaction. Not just two, but multiple. Yes?
Where does plant health or vigor come into this?
That comes in carrying capacity.
No, I'm talking about why do you have objectives to increase herbaceous cover, plant health, root growth?
When we calculate carrying capacity, we got net primary production. How much is there? And then we start going in, what is the goal? How much do we want to have used? I say there's 100 kilos here, and I want 50 kilos left, and then you come in and say, no, we have this species that needs even less than that, so we reduce it again. I've reduced the carrying capacity before we even got started.
Then how do you factor in cool versus warm season growth?
That's all part of the timing of use.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions. Let's give Dr. Miller a round of applause.